My name is Ramona, and I'm 50 years old. When my grandson told me to hurry up and die, something inside me shattered. Yes, I became a grandmother too young, some might say. I had my daughter at 20, and she, in turn, had her son when she was barely out of high school. Life has a way of folding in on itself, accelerating the milestones before you're ready. People whispered about it back then. Said our family tree was rushing through seasons. But I didn't care. To me, my grandson wasn't a mistake or a scandal, he was a blessing. When I first held Kellen in my arms, I felt a kind of love I can't describe in words. He was small, fragile, yet powerful enough to reroute the course of my life. I promised him, right there in the delivery room, that I would always be his safe place. That no matter what storms the world hurled his way, he would never face them alone. And for many years I kept that promise. I was the one who babysat when my daughter was overwhelmed. I was the one who packed lunches, attended school concerts, and sat in the front row of graduations, cheering louder than anyone else. I spent money I didn't have on sneakers he wanted, on birthday parties bigger than my budget, on Christmas gifts that lit up his face. Because seeing him happy made me happy. Because isn't that what grandparents are supposed to do? Love without limits? But somewhere along the way, that love stopped being enough. As Kellen grew older, he changed. At first it was subtle, asking for things instead of appreciating them. Rolling his eyes when I told him stories from the past, sighing impatiently when I wanted a hug. I told myself it was normal, just teenage rebellion, just the growing pains of a boy trying to carve out his independence. I thought, he'll come back around, they always do, but he didn't. By the time he reached his 20s, the sweet boy I once knew had hardened into someone I barely recognized. He stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource. His questions weren't about how I was feeling or what I needed, they were about what I had. Grandma, when you're gone, who gets the house? Grandma, you've got savings, right? What's going to happen with that? Always circling back to money, to property, to inheritance. Each time, I laughed it off, tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but deep down, a knot began to form in my stomach. Because no matter how I tried to ignore it, the truth was becoming clearer with each passing day. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at what I would leave behind. And then came the day that broke me. It wasn't even during a fight. That's the part that stings the most. We were sitting in the living room, the afternoon sunlight spilling across the carpet. I had made him lunch, like I always did. He was scrolling on his phone, barely acknowledging me, when out of nowhere, he sighed and said, "Grandma, why don't you just hurry up and die already? Then I can actually do something with this house." The words landed like a slap, but worse. A slap would have stung and faded. These words embedded themselves into me like shards of glass. I froze. I thought surely I had misheard him. Surely he hadn't just said that. But when I looked at him, he didn't even flinch. He didn't apologize or laugh it off. He just kept scrolling, his face calm, as though he had asked me to pass the salt instead of telling me to die. In that moment, something inside me cracked open. All the years I had given him, every meal, every gift, every tear, every sacrifice collapsed in on themselves. He didn't see me as a grandmother. He didn't see me as Ramona, a woman who had lived, loved, worked, and struggled. To him, I was an obstacle. A body in a chair, holding on to property he believed belonged to him. I excused myself to the bathroom, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the tub with my hands shaking. I stared at my reflection in the mirror and asked myself a question I never thought I'd have to ask. What am I to him, really? The answer was devastating. I was a means to an end. Nothing more. For hours after he left, I sat in silence, replaying his words over and over until they carved grooves into my soul. Hurry up and die. As if my life had no value except for what it could be traded for after my last breath. I thought about my daughter, about the way she always tried to smooth things over, always making excuses for him. "He's just young, Mom," she'd say. "He doesn't mean it. You know he loves you." But love doesn't sound like that. Love doesn't wish you dead just to speed up a payday. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I knew something had changed forever. I couldn't go back to pretending. I couldn't unhear those words. And I couldn't let them be the last chapter of my story, because I wasn't going to die on his timeline. But I wasn't going to die on his terms. I gave everything I had to build a better life for my family. I wasn't supposed to be a grandmother at 50. In another life, maybe I would still be traveling, still discovering new hobbies, still dreaming about what came next. But life had other plans for me. I became a mother young, barely out of my teens, and when my daughter, Sophia, became pregnant at 18, I didn't hesitate. I stepped in. I always stepped in. That's what I did. I worked 2 jobs in those early years, mornings at the diner, nights at a cleaning service. My hands smelled of bleach and dish soap, and my feet ached until I cried myself to sleep. But every paycheck went towards something bigger, a roof over our heads, food on the table, a future I hoped would be brighter than my past. When Kellen was born, I felt like I was being given a second chance to do things right. I held him against my chest in the hospital and whispered promises into his tiny ear. "You're going to have a good life." I told him. "I'll make sure of it." I made good on that promise. I paid for diapers, formula, and doctor visits when Sophia couldn't. I stayed up with Kellen through the night so she could sleep before her shifts. When the babysitter canceled, I left work early and risked losing my job. When Sophia's boyfriend left, one of many who would come and go, I was there to fill the gaps. Everything I built, my savings, my house, even the modest retirement fund, wasn't just for me. It was for them. I didn't buy new clothes for myself for years. I drove the same old car until the engine gave out on a rainy morning. I ate beans and rice for dinner so Kellen could have his favorite cereal. And at first, I thought it mattered. When Kellen was little, he would run to me after school, arms open, smiling so big it made the exhaustion worth it. He'd crawl onto my lap with a book, and I'd read until my voice went hoarse. He'd fall asleep on my chest, his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and I'd think, this is why I keep going. This is why I never stop. I never told him no when it came to school trips, sports fees, birthday parties. Even when the bills stacked up, I found a way. Because how do you explain to a child that love has limits? But little by little, the appreciation faded. By the time Kellen was in middle school, he expected things instead of asking. The shoes, the gadgets, the spending money, all of it became normal. Automatic. When I tried to explain budgets or limits, he rolled his eyes. "Grandma, you always have money," he'd say. "Why are you acting like you don't?" Sophia tried to help, but she had her own struggles. She worked sporadic jobs, moved in and out of relationships, always promising she'd do better next time. More and more, Kellen came to me for everything. I became not just his grandmother but his mother, his father, his provider, his safety net. And the weight of it began to crush me. I remember one winter night when the furnace broke. I didn't have enough saved to fix it and still cover the mortgage. So I sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out before me, hands shaking. Kellen came in and plopped down his wish list for Christmas: new phone, designer sneakers, concert tickets. He didn't even notice the tears on my cheeks. I laughed it off, told myself kids don't understand. But deep down, something started to hurt in a way that wouldn't heal. Still, I kept giving. I told myself that one day, when he was older, he would look back and see how much I had done for him. That he would thank me, maybe even take care of me in return. That was the dream that got me out of bed on the hardest mornings, the idea that all this sacrifice would mean something. But now, looking back, I see how naive I was. All those years of saying yes, all those years of stepping in, all those years of making myself invisible so he could shine. Instead of gratitude, it taught him entitlement. Instead of compassion, it taught him expectation. And yet, even after the cruel words he said, part of me still ached for the boy he used to be, the boy who clung to my leg when he was scared, who whispered, "I love you, Grandma," before falling asleep. I missed that boy. I missed the feeling that what I did mattered. But I couldn't go back. The woman who had worked herself to the bone, who had given without asking, who had allowed herself to be taken for granted. That woman was gone. And what stood in her place was someone else. Someone who had nothing left to lose, and everything left to say. And yet, the child I loved most saw me as nothing but a wallet. He grew up believing love came with a price tag. I sometimes wonder if it was my fault, if all the spoiling, all the sacrifices, all the times I said yes when I should have said no shaped him into who he became. Maybe I blurred the line between love and money so much that by the time Kellen was old enough to know the difference, he simply didn't care. When he was a child, I thought nothing of handing him a few dollars for candy or toys. His eyes lit up, and I thought, what harm could it do? But soon, it wasn't a few dollars anymore. By middle school, he expected $50 bills tucked into birthday cards and $100 sneakers because everyone else had them. I'd tell myself, he'll understand one day. He'll see how hard I worked to give him these things. But that day never came. Instead, he grew bolder. By high school, Kellen had stopped asking and started demanding. When I tried to set boundaries, he brushed me off with a smirk. "You've got money, Grandma. Why are you holding back?" As if the house payments, medical bills, and car repairs weren't real burdens. As if the cash in my wallet existed just to satisfy him. He didn't see the calluses on my hands from cleaning jobs, or the nights I skipped meals so he could eat well. He didn't want to see them. I remember one Christmas especially. I had spent weeks saving to buy him a new gaming console. It wasn't easy. I had to pick up extra shifts, stretching myself thin until my body ached, but I wanted to surprise him. I imagined the way his face would light up, the way it used to when he was younger. When he tore off the wrapping paper, his first words weren't, "Thank you." They were, "It's not the newest model." He played it anyway, of course, but the damage was done. Something in me wilted as I realized he hadn't seen the sacrifice, only the shortfall. That's when I noticed how differently he treated me compared to others. Around his friends, he was charming, polite, even affectionate. He'd post pictures of us together online with captions like, "Love my grandma." But behind closed doors, when the cameras were gone, he treated me like an ATM. If I hesitated to give him money, the sweetness soured into bitterness. "You're stingy," he'd sneer. "Don't you care about me?" Of course I cared. Caring had been my whole life. But what he meant was, "Don't you care enough to give me what I want, when I want it?" The more I gave, the more he wanted. It was never enough. And every time I said yes, I chipped away at the little piece of myself that still hoped he would grow into gratitude. But instead of gratitude, he grew into greed. When he turned 21, Kellen started asking questions that made my stomach twist. He wanted to know about my will, my savings, my house. "What's the point of waiting?" he'd joke. "We all know I'm going to get it anyway." I laughed nervously the first time, brushing it off as bad humor. But the jokes didn't stop. They became more pointed, more insistent. He'd ask what the house was worth, how much was in my bank account, what jewelry I had that could be sold. He even asked once if I had life insurance. It was no longer about what I could give him while I was alive, it was about what he could take when I was gone. I wanted to believe it was just immaturity, that he didn't realize how cruel he sounded. But deep down, I knew better. He had started to see me not as a grandmother, not as Ramona, but as an obstacle between him and an inheritance. The shift was complete when he stopped calling me just to talk. Every phone call had a purpose, asking for rent money, asking for a loan, asking for a little help until his next paycheck. The only time he showed up at my door was when he needed something. And I gave. Again and again, I gave. Because saying no felt like losing him. But the irony was, I was already losing him. The boy who once crawled into my lap and whispered, "I love you, Grandma," had been replaced by a young man who looked at me like a locked chest he was impatient to pry open. And then, one afternoon, he proved just how little he saw me. We were sitting in the living room, the sunlight falling in golden beams across the rug. I had made him a lunch, trying to recreate the sandwiches he loved as a child. He was scrolling on his phone, barely acknowledging me. I tried to talk to him about his plans, his future, but he just sighed, irritated. That's when he said it. "Grandma, why don't you just hurry up and die already? Then I can actually do something with this house. The words were so casual, so cold, they almost didn't register. But when they did, it was like the air had been punched out of my lungs. He didn't even look up from his phone. That was the moment everything changed. And then came the words that burned me to the core. Hurry up and die. I never thought I'd hear those words from someone I loved. Not from strangers. Not from enemies. And certainly not from my own grandson. But there it was. Sharp and venomous. Dropping from his lips like it cost him nothing. At first, I froze. My brain couldn't catch up with what my ears had just heard. I waited for him to laugh, to say he was kidding, to backpedal in some way. But he didn't. He just sat there, scrolling on his phone, as though he had commented on the weather instead of telling his grandmother she should die. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What? What did you just say? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Kellen looked up, annoyed that I had interrupted his scrolling. He shrugged. I'm just saying, Grandma, you're not getting any younger. You've got this whole house, all this stuff, and what do you even do with it? You sit here, you keep it all locked up. One day it'll be mine anyway, so why not sooner? The casualness of it sliced deeper than if he had shouted. I felt my hands trembling against my lap. My chest was tight, but not from age or illness. It was from the sheer disbelief that someone I had poured my life into could dismiss me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience standing between him and property. Kellen, my voice cracked. Do you even hear yourself? He rolled his eyes, the same way he used to when I told him to do chores as a teenager. Don't be so dramatic. It's just the truth. Everyone dies. You might as well make it useful when you do. Useful. He wanted my death to be useful. The words carved themselves into me, raw and permanent. Suddenly, all the years of sacrifice, the missed meals, the extra shifts, the countless times I put his needs before my own came rushing back like a tidal wave. And in that wave, I saw them drown, because none of it had mattered. Not to him. Not anymore. I tried to speak, but the tears burned my throat. Instead, I stood abruptly, the chair scraping back against the floor. My body felt stiff, heavy, as though the weight of his words had aged me 10 years in an instant. I need a moment, I managed, before retreating down the hall. I shut myself in the bathroom and leaned over the sink, staring at my reflection. My face looked pale, my eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. For decades, I had been the strong one, the caretaker, the one who carried burdens without complaint. But in that moment, I saw nothing but a fool who had mistaken entitlement for love. I pressed my hands against the counter, my knuckles white. How could he? I whispered to the empty room. But deep down, I already knew the answer, because I had taught him. I had taught him that I would always give, that I would always sacrifice, that his wants mattered more than my needs. I had let him believe that my love was a bottomless well, and he had drained it until there was nothing left but expectation. Still, nothing could excuse what he had said. I slid down onto the bathroom floor, pulling my knees to my chest. My body shook as sobs tore out of me, raw and uncontrollable. I cried for the little boy he used to be, the one who once hugged me so tightly I thought my heart would burst. I cried for myself, for all the years I had poured into him, only to be reduced to an obstacle in his eyes. And I cried for the cruel reality staring me in the face. The grandson I loved didn't love me back. When the tears finally slowed, I felt hollow. The kind of hollow that doesn't fill back up. I wiped my face with trembling hands and stood, staring at myself in the mirror again. My eyes were red, my skin blotchy, but behind the wreckage of my expression, I saw something else. Resolve. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the years of enabling or erase the words he had spoken, but I could decide what happened next. When I walked back into the living room, Kellen was still on his phone, barely looking up. You okay? He asked casually, as if he hadn't just broken me. I didn't answer. I just nodded faintly, my lips pressed into a tight line. Because something had shifted inside me. He thought those words would scare me into compliance, into handing over what he wanted sooner, but instead, they sparked something far more dangerous: clarity. I realized then that I wasn't powerless. He might have stripped away the illusion of love, but he hadn't stripped away my ability to act. My voice, my choices, my legacy, they still belonged to me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my mind like poison. Hurry up and die. But instead of breaking me, they began to build something new. I whispered to myself in the dark, my voice steady now. No, Kellen, I won't die on your terms. I'll live on mine. That night, I knew things would never be the same. It wasn't just his cruelty, it was their silence. The day after Kellen told me to hurry up and die, I still felt the sting of his words vibrating in my chest. I couldn't get them out of my head, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. Every corner of the house reminded me of him, his baby photos still framed on the mantel, his high school trophies gathering dust in the cabinet, the quilt I had sewn for him draped over the back of the couch. All of it felt tainted now, as though one phrase had infected the whole house. But what hurt most wasn't only what he said, it was the thought of what would happen when I told Sophia. Surely, I thought, a mother would correct her child, no matter how grown he was. Surely she would be horrified. Surely she would rush to my side, hold my hand, and say, "Mom, I can't believe he said that. I'll talk to him. I'll make this right." I wanted so badly to believe that. When she picked up, her voice was rushed, distracted. I could hear the background noise of a television and someone talking in the distance. "Hey, Mom, what's up? Can I call you back? I'm kind of busy right now." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "It's important. It's about Kellen." "What about him?" I took a breath, trying to steady myself. "He said something to me yesterday. Something awful. He told me to hurry up and die so he could have the house." There was a pause, long enough for hope to flicker in my chest. Maybe she was shocked. Maybe she was trying to process. Maybe she was about to scold him so fiercely that I'd hear it through the phone. Instead, she sighed. "Oh, Mom, you know how he is. He doesn't mean stuff like that. He's just blunt. You can't take everything he says so seriously." Her words hit me harder than Kellen's had. At least his cruelty was honest. Hers was dismissal. "Sophia," I whispered, my voice breaking. "He told me to die. How can I not take that seriously?" "He was probably joking," she said, her tone defensive now. "You know he's under a lot of stress, work, bills, life. Sometimes he says things he doesn't mean. Don't hold it against him. Don't hold it against him." It was as if she had reached into my chest and pulled the last shred of validation from me. Not only had my grandson wished me dead, but my daughter, the child I raised, was excusing it. "I can't believe you're defending him," I said softly. "Do you know how much I've done for him? For you? And this is what I get?" There was another pause. Then, colder this time, she said, "Mom, I'm not defending him. I'm just saying you need to pick your battles. He loves you, okay? You know he does. Don't let one careless comment ruin everything." But it wasn't careless. It wasn't one comment. It was the truth slipping through, raw and unfiltered. "I have to go," she added, her voice brisk now. "We'll talk later." And just like that, she hung up. I sat there with the silent phone pressed against my ear. It wasn't just Kellen who had betrayed me, it was Sophia too. Her silence, her excuses, her refusal to stand up for me cut just as deeply. Later that week, I tried again. I spoke to my sister Claudia, hoping she would understand. She listened, frowning, but when I finished, all she said was, "Families fight, Ramona. Kids these days, they say terrible things. You can't take it to heart. He's still your grandson. Still my grandson." As if blood ties excused everything. As if his words could be brushed aside because we shared DNA. Everywhere I turned, I found the same response. Silence, excuses, dismissal. People didn't want to believe it. They didn't want to see him for what he was, because it was easier to label me as sensitive than to admit that someone they loved was capable of cruelty. So I stopped telling people. I carried the burden alone, letting their silence echo in my heart. And in that silence, something inside me began to harden. For years, I had given everything: my time, my money, my energy, because I believed family would protect me in return. But now I saw the truth. Family doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes, family is just the group of people who take you for granted the most. I was done waiting for them to defend me. If no one else would see my worth, I would. If no one else would protect my legacy, I would. Because if there was one thing I learned that week, it was this: the cruelty of one person can cut you, but the silence of the people around them can bury you. And I refused to be buried while I was still alive. If no one else would defend my worth, I would. I had been quiet too long. Silence had been my survival strategy for most of my life. When my ex-husband ignored me, I stayed quiet. When my boss piled extra work on me without extra pay, I stayed quiet. When Sophia made reckless choices that fell back on me, I stayed quiet. And when Kellen started showing signs of entitlement, I told myself to endure it, that if I just gave a little more, things would smooth out. But his words, "hurry up and die," were the sound of silence shattering. I couldn't go back to swallowing pain. I couldn't keep excusing behavior that broke me. For the first time in decades, I realized that my quiet wasn't noble. It wasn't patience. It wasn't even strength. My quiet had been their weapon. Every time I held my tongue, it gave them permission to push further, to take more. I hadn't just been enduring their behavior, I had been feeding it. The thought made me sick. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The house was dark except for the glow of the lamp, and for once, the silence didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like clarity. I thought about my life, about all the years I'd given away to people who saw me as a safety net instead of a person. What did I have left to show for it? Yes, I had the house. Yes, I had some savings tucked away. Yes, I had worked hard enough to build stability when life had done everything to knock me down. But what good was all of that, if the only people who benefited were the very ones who disrespected me the most? I realized something that night. Love is a gift, not an obligation. And if someone takes that gift and spits on it, you don't keep handing it back. Kellen had made his choice. Sophia had made hers. Now it was time for me to make mine. I took out a notepad and a pen, my hands trembling slightly. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 words: my last will. The phrase alone made my chest tighten. I was only 50, not young, but not old enough that I thought about death every day. Still, Kellen had shoved the thought into my face. And if my life really was limited, then I wanted to make damn sure that my death didn't become his payday. I began jotting notes. Who had been there for me? Who had shown me kindness without strings attached? Mrs. Riley. My neighbor who checked in on me after doctor's appointments. My friend Gloria, who brought me meals when I was too tired to cook. My cousin May, who always remembered my birthday even when my own children didn't. These were people who gave without expecting, who saw me as a human being instead of a resource. I wrote their names down with relief, as though each name lightened the weight on my shoulders. Then, on a separate sheet, I wrote Kellen's name. Just his name. I stared at it for a long time, my pen hovering over the page. I thought about everything I'd given him: the shoes, the consoles, the tuition payments, the countless rides and meals and sacrifices. I thought about the boy who used to love me and the man who had told me to die. And then I drew a line through his name. A thick, black line. Tears slid down my cheeks as I did it, but not from sadness. From release. For the first time in years, I felt like I was choosing myself. The next morning, I called an attorney whose card I had tucked away in a drawer. A woman named Evelyn Pierce. We had met years ago at a church event, and I remembered her saying she specialized in estate planning. I didn't tell her much over the phone, just that I needed to update my will, urgently. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "Come by tomorrow. We'll make sure your wishes are clear." When I hung up the phone, A strange calm settled over me. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was acting. Kellen thought his words had crushed me. But all they had done was wake me up. As I walked through my house that day, I noticed everything differently. The dining room table where so many meals had been shared. The living room couch where Kellen once napped after school. The garden outside where I had planted roses my mother once loved. These weren't just objects, they were pieces of me. And I decided then and there that I would place them in the hands of people who valued them, not people who only saw dollar signs. When Sophia called that evening, I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't listen to another round of excuses for her son. I couldn't bear to hear her brush it off again. Not when I had finally found the strength to stop brushing it off myself. Instead, I sat in the quiet with my notepad, refining my list, feeling stronger with every stroke of the pen. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't voiceless, and I wasn't finished. He thought he broke me, but I was only beginning. I sped up the paperwork. Walking into Evelyn Pierce's law office felt like stepping into another world. The place smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the walls lined with certificates and neatly stacked folders. It was quiet, steady, professional, a sharp contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. Evelyn greeted me with a warm smile. She was in her mid-50s. Her hair silver at the temples. Her presence both calm and commanding. "Ramona," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "I'm glad you called. Let's sit down and talk about what you need." For a moment, I hesitated. Speaking the truth out loud meant admitting to myself how deep the wound went. But when I looked into Evelyn's kind, steady eyes, the words spilled out. I told her about Kellen, about the way he had grown entitled over the years, about the day he told me to hurry up and die. My voice cracked as I repeated the words, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply listened. Her pen resting on the notepad in front of her, her expression soft but resolute. When I finished, she nodded once. "I understand. You want to make sure your legacy doesn't end up in the wrong hands." "Yes," I whispered. "Exactly. I don't want my life's work, my sacrifices, everything I've built, to become a reward for cruelty. I want it to mean something. I want it to go to people who actually value me." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her voice calm but firm. "Then we'll make it happen. We'll draw up a new will. We'll ensure it's airtight, legally binding, with no room for challenge. And we'll do it quietly, so no one sees it coming." Her confidence was like a balm on my soul. For the first time since that horrible day, I felt like I was regaining control. We spent hours going over details. I listed the people who had stood by me: Gloria, my friend who had cooked for me when I was sick; Mrs. Riley, my neighbor who always shoveled my walkway after snowstorms; Cousin May, who never forgot to call on my birthday. Each name I added brought a sense of peace, as though I was weaving a safety net for my memory. Then came the question of charities. Evelyn suggested I think about causes that mattered to me. I thought of my late mother, who had always wanted me to finish school but knew I couldn't afford college. A scholarship fund for young women like me, I decided. And a donation to the local hospice center, where strangers had shown my family kindness when my father passed. It felt right. It felt like love. And then we came to Kellen. "What about him?" Evelyn asked gently. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave him nothing at all. But another part of me, the part that had been humiliated, erased, wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done. I didn't want silence. I wanted a message, so I decided on something symbolic, something that would sting more than being ignored. "For Kellen," I said slowly, "leave him the quilt I made him when he was a boy. The one he used to sleep under. Nothing else, just that." Evelyn's eyes softened, but she didn't argue. She simply wrote it down, her pen scratching firmly against the paper. We finalized the draft over the next week, every clause carefully worded, every loophole sealed. Evelyn was meticulous, walking me through each decision, making sure I understood exactly what would happen. When I signed the final version, my hand trembled, but not from fear. From power. "This," Evelyn said, sliding the document into its folder, "is your voice. Even after you're gone, this will speak for you. No one can silence it. I exhaled, a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For once, I felt lighter. As I left her office, the late afternoon sun hit my face. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting it warm me, and I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to what others wanted. I was choosing for myself. Back at home, Kellen continued his usual games. He dropped by, asked for money, complained about bills. He made little jabs about my age, about how, one day, all this will be mine. Each time, I smiled faintly, pretending to be the same old grandmother who let things slide. But inside, I was different. Inside, I was already free. Because the truth was written down now, stamped, signed, and sealed. My story was mine again. My future, what was left of it, was secure. And when my time came, Kellen wouldn't inherit my silence. He'd inherit the truth. By the time he realized, it would be too late. The greed only grew louder. After I signed the new will, I carried a secret strength inside me that no one could see. Outwardly, I remained the same, quiet, accommodating, the grandmother who always had an extra meal on the stove or a $20 bill tucked in her wallet, just in case. But inside, I was different. I was armored with the knowledge that my voice was preserved in ink and law, untouchable by anyone who thought they could silence me. And Kellen? Well, his mask was slipping more every day. At first, he didn't notice the shift in me. He kept acting the same, showing up at odd hours with his hand out. Grandma, can you spot me for gas? Grandma, I need a little extra for rent this month. Grandma, you'll pay me back when you're gone anyway, so what's the difference? He laughed when he said it, but his eyes were dead serious. I gave him small amounts here and there, not because I wanted to, but because keeping him complacent was part of the plan. The more he thought I was the same old pushover, the less he would suspect what I had done. And the more brazen he became, the sweeter the fall would be. His entitlement grew like a weed. One afternoon, he brought a friend over to the house. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when I overheard their conversation in the living room. "See this place?" Kellen said, his voice full of swagger. "It'll be mine soon. Grandma's not gonna last forever, and when she's gone, I'm cashing out." I froze, my rag clutched in my hand. His friend laughed nervously. "Dude, that's cold," Kellen shrugged. "It's just reality. She's had her life. Time for me to have mine." The words stung, but instead of tears, a smile crept across my face. Because he had no idea, no clue that I had already written him out. He was boasting about a future that didn't exist. Later that week, he tried to push even further. He sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone. "You know, Grandma, if we sold this house now, you could move into something smaller. Easier for you, right? And I could use the extra money to get started. We'd both win." I sipped my tea, hiding the fire in my chest. "This house has been my home for 30 years, Kellen," I said calmly. "It's not going anywhere." He smirked. "We'll see." The arrogance in his voice used to break me. Now, it fueled me. Every word he spoke only justified what I had done with Evelyn. The escalation didn't stop there. He began checking in more frequently, but not out of concern. He'd eye my health, ask pointed questions. "How's your heart these days? Still taking those pills? Doctor say anything new?" It wasn't care, it was calculation. He was taking inventory of my decline, like a vulture circling above. And the cruelest part? Sophia still made excuses for him. When I told her he was pressing about the house, she brushed it off. "He's just ambitious, Mom. He's thinking about his future." Ambition, she called it. I called it greed. But I stayed silent with her too. What was the point of arguing? She had chosen to blind herself to who her son truly was. One day, the truth would be impossible for her to ignore. And I would be the one to force her to face it. So I waited. I played my role. I cooked his meals, handed him his 20s, listened to him brag about the future he thought was guaranteed. Inside, I savored every second. Because I knew what he didn't, that the higher he climbed on his ladder of greed, the harder his fall would be when it snapped beneath him. And it would snap. The higher he climbed, the farther he would fall. I felt my body slowing, but my spirit sharpened. It started with fatigue that clung to me like a shadow. Simple tasks, watering the garden, folding laundry, walking up the stairs, left me breathless. At first, I brushed it off as stress, or maybe just the aches of turning 50. But then came the dizzy spells, the tightness in my chest, the nights I lay awake, my heart racing as if it were trying to outrun me. I went to the doctor, hoping for reassurance. Instead, I left with prescriptions and a warning. My health wasn't collapsing overnight, but it was declining. And unless I made drastic changes, time might not be as long as I once assumed. Sitting in that sterile office, listening to the doctor's words, I thought of Kellen immediately. I thought of the way he looked at me as though I were already gone. I thought of the way he casually asked about my heart pills, his tone more curious than concerned. For the first time, I admitted to myself that my life was shorter than I wanted it to be. But instead of despair, I felt urgency. Urgency to make sure my choices held. Urgency to ensure no one could undo what I had worked with Evelyn to protect. So I called her. When I told Evelyn about the doctor's visit, she didn't waste a second. "Then we make sure everything is watertight," she said. "I'll update the will, double-check every clause, and make sure copies are secured in multiple places. If anyone tries to contest it, they'll fail." Her words steadied me. Knowing my voice would live on, even if my body failed, gave me a peace I hadn't felt in years. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into the details. Every afternoon, I'd sit with my notebook, reviewing names, charities, gifts. I added more specifics, more clarity. The scholarship fund would go to young women who wanted to study nursing, an echo of the career I once dreamed of but couldn't afford. The hospice donation would be earmarked for patient comfort, new chairs, blankets, meals for families keeping vigil at bedsides. I wanted every dollar to matter. For those who had shown me kindness, I left tokens that carried my love. Gloria would get the jewelry box she had admired. Mrs. Riley, the antique clock she once said reminded her of her father. May would inherit the family recipes, handwritten in my mother's careful script. And for Kellen, I didn't change a thing. He would still get the quilt. Just the quilt. A reminder of the warmth he had once known and thrown away. The illness made my days shorter, but strangely, it made my nights longer. Lying in bed, listening to the sound of the clock ticking in the living room, I often wondered how much time I had left, and instead of fear, I felt determination. Every beat of my heart, no matter how weak, reminded me of my purpose: to leave behind something stronger than Kellen's greed. Meanwhile, he grew more impatient. He called more often, stopped by, unannounced. His eyes darted around the house like a surveyor appraising land. "You've really held on to this place," he said one afternoon, running his hand along the banister. "A lot of value here. Shame it's just sitting." I smiled faintly, my breath shallow from the effort of walking across the room. "It's not just sitting, Kellen, it's living. This house raised 3 generations." He rolled his eyes. Yeah, but let's be real, you can't take it with you." The cruelty in his tone didn't hurt me anymore, not because it wasn't sharp, but because I knew I had already blunted it. He could circle me like a vulture all he wanted. There would be no feast when I was gone, only scraps. One evening, after a particularly bad dizzy spell, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The roses in my garden swayed in the breeze, their petals glowing pink in the fading light. I thought of my mother, of the way she used to tell me, "Roses bloom even after the frost, Ramona. Remember that." And I realized something. Even if my body failed, my choices would bloom. My legacy would blossom long after Kellen's bitterness faded into nothing. I wasn't afraid of the illness anymore. I was afraid of nothing. Because I had already beaten the one thing that haunted me most, the fear of being erased. If he thought he controlled my ending, he was wrong. I was ready not for death but for justice. As my body weakened, I began to move, slower through the house, almost like I was saying goodbye to each room. The kitchen, where I had spent countless nights cooking for others. The living room where Kellen once sprawled out on the rug, playing with toy cars. The garden where I had planted roses in honor of my mother. Each space carried echoes of my life, my laughter, my tears, my sacrifices. And strangely, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt a calmness I hadn't expected. Because for the first time in decades, I knew that everything I had built would not be wasted. My choices were safe. My voice was sealed in legal ink. Kellen could not erase me, no matter how desperately he wished to. The days blurred together in a quiet rhythm. Morning tea, a short walk around the garden. Afternoons spent with Evelyn finalizing small details, making sure no loophole remained. Evenings where I sat by the window, wrapped in the quilt I had kept for myself, the sister to the one I would leave Kellen. That quilt had seen me through so many winters, and now it saw me through my final season. Kellen's visits grew more frequent, and with each one, I saw more of his greed exposed. He tried to act concerned, asking about my medications, offering to help with bills. But beneath the thin veneer of care was calculation. His eyes roamed the house like a thief casing a target. One afternoon, he stood by the fireplace, staring at the photographs on the mantel. "You know, Grandma," he said casually, "you should really write things down. Make sure there's no confusion later. I wouldn't want anyone else getting what's rightfully mine." I sipped my tea, hiding my smile. "Don't worry, Kellen, everything is written down." He smirked, satisfied with the answer, never realizing the double meaning behind my words. Meanwhile, Sophia called occasionally, but our conversations were short, hollow. She asked about my health in the same way someone asks about the weather out of obligation, not care. I didn't bother, telling her about the will. She would find out soon enough, and maybe then she'd understand the weight of the silence she had given me. As my strength declined, small tasks became monumental. I couldn't carry laundry upstairs anymore. Cooking full meals wore me out. Even writing in my notebook left my hand aching. But instead of despair, I felt release. For once, I wasn't carrying everyone else's burdens. For once, I was allowed to rest. I spent my final days giving myself the gift I had always denied: peace. I read books I had put off. I listened to music my mother once loved. I sat in the garden and let the sun warm my face, letting myself feel like a woman, not just a caretaker. There was one moment, near the end, that stays with me. I was sitting on the porch at dusk, watching the sky shift to shades of lavender and gold. The world was quiet except for the crickets. And for the first time in years, I whispered to myself, I mattered. Because I did, not to Kellen, not even to Sophia perhaps, but to the neighbors, the friends, the strangers who would one day benefit from the scholarships and donations. I mattered. My life meant something. And in that realization, I found peace with letting go. The last night I was fully lucid, I asked Evelyn to visit. She sat by my bedside, holding my hand, reading through the will one last time in her steady voice. Every line, every word, was exactly as I wanted it. When she finished, she squeezed my hand. "Ramona, you've done something powerful. You've made sure your story won't be twisted. You've made sure your truth will be heard." Tears pricked my eyes. But they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered. Later, as the room grew quiet and the stars appeared outside my window, I closed my eyes. My breathing slowed, my body heavy against the bed. I thought of my mother, my father, the loved ones who had gone before me. I thought of the little girl I used to be, and the woman I had become. I thought of Kellen's cruel words, and how I had turned them into my strength. And then, with one final thought, I let myself drift. He will hear me. He will finally hear me. He would hear me after I was gone. He came expecting gold but found ashes. I wasn't there in body when the will was read, but I was there in every word. Evelyn made sure of that. She told me before I passed that she would handle the reading personally, that she would be my voice in the room when I could no longer speak. And in that way, I knew I would have the last word. The reading took place in Evelyn's office, in a room that smelled faintly of leather and paper. The blinds were drawn, the table polished, the documents neatly stacked before her. My family sat waiting, Sophia, tense and fidgeting. Kellen, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. And a few extended relatives who had come more out of curiosity than expectation. I can imagine Kellen's smugness as Evelyn began. He probably thought the formality was unnecessary. In his mind, he already owned the house, the savings, everything I had worked for. He probably pictured himself walking out of that office with a fortune, his future secured by my death. But Evelyn's steady voice cut through his fantasies. She began with the usual formalities, stating my name, my age, the date the will had been signed. Then she moved into the heart of it. To my dear friends and neighbors who have shown me kindness without asking for anything in return, Evelyn read, I leave tokens of my gratitude. To Gloria, who fed me when I was too tired to cook, I leave my jewelry box, which she once admired. To Mrs. Riley, my neighbor and constant helper, I leave my antique clock, a reminder of her father. To my cousin May, who always remembered my birthday, I leave the family recipes, handwritten by my mother. I can picture the way their faces lit up at those words, the surprise, the tears, the gratitude. Small gifts, perhaps, but gifts heavy with love. Then Evelyn continued. To causes close to my heart, I leave the majority of my estate. To the hospice center that brought my family comfort in our darkest days, I leave a donation to improve care for families like mine. To the scholarship fund for young women, I leave a sum to help them pursue nursing, a dream I once had and could not afford. At this, a murmur rippled through the room. I imagined Sophia shifting in her seat, her brow furrowing. This wasn't what she expected. This wasn't what Kellen expected. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. To my grandson, Kellen, Evelyn read slowly, her voice steady. I leave the quilt I sewed for him when he was a boy. It kept him warm through many winters, a symbol of the love I once poured into him. May it remind him of what he had, and what he chose to throw away. Silence. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, pressing down on everyone in the room. Kellen's smirk vanished. His face must have gone pale, his hands curling into fists. I wasn't there to see it, but I can imagine it with perfect clarity, the disbelief, the anger, the humiliation. He had come expecting gold, and I had handed him ashes. Evelyn didn't stop. She read through the rest of the clauses, making sure every word was clear. There was no loophole, no space for misinterpretation. Everything had been accounted for, everything was sealed. By the end, there was no doubt. Kellen had been left with nothing but a memory of love he had squandered. I know Sophia must have been stunned too. Perhaps she felt shame for the way she had excused him, for the way she had dismissed my pain. Perhaps not. But one thing is certain. She could no longer deny who her son had become. My will was undeniable proof of the truth she refused to face. When Evelyn finally closed the folder, the room must have felt like a battlefield after the smoke cleared. Those who had been remembered wiped their tears, holding their gifts close. Those who had been cut out sat in silence, their expectations shattered. And Kellen? I hope he felt the weight of the quilt as Evelyn handed it to him. I hope the softness of the fabric burned in his hands, reminding him of nights when he was wrapped in my love, nights when he was too young to know the difference between giving and taking. I hope he realized, in that moment, that he had traded everything for greed and lost. Because the truth was clear now. My life's work, my sacrifices, my legacy, they would not be his. The room fell silent as his face turned pale. The mask he wore slipped in front of everyone. I may not have been in that room when the will was read. But in my heart, I was sitting in the corner, watching every second unfold. I can imagine Kellen's face as clearly as if I'd been staring right at him. That smirk, the one he wore so confidently, melting into shock, then fury, then humiliation. For once in his life, he had nothing to say. But Kellen was never one to stay silent for long. Evelyn told me later that as soon as she closed the folder, he erupted. This is ridiculous, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table so hard that a glass of water toppled over. She can't do this. I'm her grandson. I was supposed to get the house, the savings, everything. Evelyn, calm as always, looked him squarely in the eye. She could, and she did. This was her choice, Kellen. Legally sound, fully witnessed and signed when she was of sound mind. There is no contest. His face flushed red, his voice rising. She was manipulated. Someone tricked her into this. She loved me, she always said she did. She wouldn't just throw me away like this. But no one rushed to defend him. For years, my family had made excuses for Kellen. They had brushed off his cruelty, hidden his entitlement, told me I was too sensitive. But in that room, with Evelyn's steady voice delivering my truth, there was no more denying it. My words had stripped his mask away, and what stood beneath it was ugly. Sophia sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. She didn't speak, not to defend me, not to defend him. Maybe she finally saw what I had been trying to tell her all along. Maybe she was too ashamed to admit that she had let it come to this. Either way, her silence now was different from before. This time, it wasn't dismissive, it was damning. The extended relatives shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Kellen's rage and Evelyn's calm authority. A few of them whispered, and I can only imagine the words. Greedy. Entitled. Heartless. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply repeated, "This was her choice." Kellen stormed out before the reading was even officially finished. The quilt clutched in his fist. The door slammed behind him, leaving the others in stunned quiet. Later, Evelyn told me how the atmosphere shifted after his exit. The room felt lighter, she said, as if his anger had been a storm cloud keeping everyone else in shadow. The people who had been remembered in my will sat straighter, their eyes shining with tears, pride, relief. They spoke softly about how much it meant to be thought of, to be remembered not with money alone but with love. And then there was Sophia. She lingered after everyone else had gone, sitting in the chair across from Evelyn, staring at the polished table. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would she do this? Why would she cut him out?" Evelyn's answer was simple. Because she wanted her legacy to reflect love, not greed. She wanted her story told the way she lived it by choice, not by coercion. Sophia cried then, silent tears slipping down her face. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps regret, perhaps both. But it didn't matter anymore. My words had been spoken. My truth had been heard. And Kellen? His downfall had only just begun. Word spread quickly after. The will reading. Families talk. Neighbors gossip. Soon, everyone knew. Kellen had been cut out of his grandmother's estate, left with nothing but a quilt. The whispers followed him everywhere. At work, people looked at him differently. Friends teased him at first, then avoided him when they saw how bitter he became. The proud image he had built of himself, the man who would inherit comfort without effort, crumbled in front of him. Meanwhile, those who had been remembered in my will walked taller. Mrs. Riley hung the antique clock in her living room, telling visitors proudly, "Ramona left this to me." Gloria kept my jewelry box on her dresser, polishing it often, her eyes soft whenever she touched it. Cousin May copied out the family recipes for her daughters, passing down the history that I had worked so hard to preserve. The difference was clear. Kellen had nothing but bitterness. The others had memory, meaning, love. And me? I had peace. Because this was never about money. It was about dignity. About reclaiming the voice that had been stolen from me. About proving that even in death I could not be erased. The fallout was exactly what I had hoped for, not revenge but revelation. Kellen's true nature was revealed for all to see. And my true legacy was secured where it belonged in the hands of those who cared. For once, my silence roared louder than his rage. I gave him nothing, and I gave the world everything. After the reading of my will, the ripples of my choices began to spread outward, far beyond that tense room where Kellen's arrogance collapsed in on itself. My name Ramona was no longer just a name whispered in family circles. It became a story. One told with pride, gratitude, and even reverence by people who had once been bystanders in my life, but were now part of my legacy. The hospice center was the first to act. With the donation I left, they purchased reclining chairs for families who kept vigil at their loved ones' bedsides. They added a small fund for meals so no one would have to choose between staying with the dying or stepping out to find food. I imagined strangers I'd never meet sitting in those chairs, eating those meals, whispering to themselves, "Thank God someone thought of this." My scholarship fund, too, took root quickly. It was named the Ramona Hale Memorial Scholarship for nursing students. I could almost hear my mother's voice when I read the announcement in the local paper from beyond. "See, Mija, you did what we couldn't. You made it possible for others to chase the dream." The first recipient was a young woman named Brielle. She had grown up in foster care, working nights at a diner just like I once had. Her essay spoke of wanting to become a nurse to help kids who felt forgotten. When she was awarded the scholarship, she said, "Ramona gave me a chance when no one else would." Those words were everything I had ever wanted to hear. Closer to home, my friends and neighbors held onto the gifts I left them with tenderness. Gloria told her church group about the jewelry box, holding it up as if it were a crown. "She remembered me," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you know what that means? To be remembered, Mrs." Riley's antique clock chimed in her living room, and each sound reminded her not just of me, but of the bond we had shared. And Cousin May, with the family recipes, gathered her children in the kitchen and taught them how to make the same dishes my mother once cooked. My mother's hands, through me, through May's daughters still shaping bread, still stirring stews, still living. That was the beauty of legacy. It multiplied. And all the while, Kellen's bitterness ate him alive. At first, he tried to spin the story. He told people the will wasn't fair, that I'd been manipulated, that Evelyn had tricked me. But the more he spoke, the more people saw through him. They knew me. They knew the kind of woman I was. And they knew Evelyn's reputation unshakable, precise, respected. His complaints sounded hollow, his rage transparent. Then came the ridicule. People whispered when he passed, "That's the one who got cut out." His so-called friends drifted away, no longer entertained by his arrogance. Employers heard the rumors and questioned his character. His once bright future dimmed into obscurity, not because I had taken anything from him, but because he had taken everything for granted. I sometimes imagine him sitting alone at night, the quilt I left him draped over his lap. Maybe he throws it across the room in anger. Maybe he buries his face in it when no one's watching, remembering the nights when it meant warmth and safety. Maybe he wishes he could undo the words he said to me, the cruelty he spat so casually. But by then, it doesn't matter. My decision is permanent, and so is the lesson he must live with. Meanwhile, my story spread. Neighbors told neighbors. Families told children. She stood up for herself, they said. She refused to let greed define her. My name became a warning and a blessing, proof that even those dismissed as weak or sentimental could wield incredible strength. And that was what I wanted most of all. Not revenge, not even justice, but remembrance. To know that when I was gone, I would not vanish into silence. That my sacrifices would not be erased, my voice not drowned out. I gave Kellen nothing but a reminder of what he had lost. And in doing so, I gave the world everything I had left: kindness, love, memory, dignity. I was no longer just a grandmother, or a caretaker, or the quiet woman in the background of family photos. I was a legacy. He wanted me gone, but I made myself unforgettable. Your worth cannot be decided by those who fail to see it. If you've stayed with me through this story, you already know the hardest truth I had to face. The people we love most can sometimes hurt us the deepest. I never imagined that my own grandson, the boy I once cradled in my arms, the boy I once promised the world to, would be the one to look me in the eyes and tell me to hurry up and die. I never imagined that my daughter, the child I raised, would excuse those words, dismiss them as if they were nothing but youthful foolishness. But here's what I want you to understand. Their cruelty didn't erase me. Their silence didn't define me. And their greed didn't determine my worth. For too long, I lived as though my voice didn't matter. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, that if I gave enough, if I worked enough, if I endured enough, eventually I'd be seen. But that's not how it works. People who only take will never see you as long as you keep giving. You have to stop. You have to draw the line. You have to decide that your dignity is worth more than their approval. That's what I did when I sat down with Evelyn and rewrote my will. I wasn't just dividing assets. I wasn't just making legal choices. I was reclaiming my story. I was making sure that even in death, my voice would be louder than Kellen's greed. And I'll tell you something else. It worked. I didn't leave him money. I didn't leave him property. I didn't leave him the inheritance he thought he was entitled to. I left him a quilt. A simple quilt, sewn with love, once wrapped around him in childhood. Because that quilt wasn't just fabric, it was a memory. A reminder of love freely given, and of how he squandered it. That was his inheritance. The knowledge of what he lost, and the reminder that he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, I left the rest to people who mattered, to causes that mattered, to strangers who would never know my face but would know my name because it helped them rise. That's what legacy really is. Not money, not property, but impact. If you're listening to me now, maybe you've been made to feel invisible too. Maybe your family takes you for granted. Maybe you've been told you're too old, too sentimental, too weak, too irrelevant. Let me tell you something. You are not. You matter. Your story matters. Your choices matter. Don't let anyone, grandchild, child, spouse, friend, anyone convince you otherwise. If they try to erase you, find a way to write yourself back in. If they try to silence you, find a way to make your voice echo long after you're gone. You don't have to leave behind millions or monuments. Every act of love, every gift of kindness, every moment of dignity, that's legacy. That's what people remember. I thought my life would end quietly, with no one noticing. But instead, it ended with my truth ringing louder than the lies told about me. My story became bigger than my pain. And that's all I ever wanted. To be remembered not as a victim of cruelty, but as a woman who chose dignity over silence. So to you, the one listening now, don't wait until someone tells you to hurry up and die to realize how much your life is worth. Take back your story. Choose who you are, what you stand for, and how you will be remembered. Because your worth cannot be decided by those who fail to see it. Because in the end, I wasn't erased, I was eternal.